Okay, so thanks very much indeed for joining. My name's Archie. I head up the indirect business for MySQL in Northern Europe, and I'm going to present a number of slides today which are going to explain what MySQL is and why we promote MySQL Enterprise and why it should be good for you and your customers. So without further ado, what is MySQL? MySQL is the world's most popular open source database. It's ideal for engineered applications. Now, what I mean by engineered applications, it's the applications that the customers are writing and building themselves rather than going out and buying applications. These are things that they're creating themselves. MySQL is part of the open source LAMP stack, as you can see on the right-hand side, with M being for MySQL. We have various versions of MySQL. We have a community version, which is free of charge. And we have a commercial version, or a couple of commercial versions. One's very much targeting companies that will embed MySQL into their application, and then there's an enterprise version, which is really what we're going to focus on today. I don't get paid on the community version, so I'm going to be focusing on the commercial version. MySQL has actually been in existence now for 26 years, so it's not a new database. It's been around for quite a long time. About 14 years ago, MySQL was acquired by Sun Microsystems. Sun Microsystems, in turn, was acquired by Oracle 12 years ago. So, if you like, MySQL by default was acquired by Oracle, even though Oracle weren't looking out to buy MySQL, they went out to buy Sun, and we came as part of the package. So 12 years ago, many people said Oracle was going to kill off MySQL because we're open source, and Oracle have a proprietary database, so they won't want to be interested in MySQL. That couldn't be any further from the truth. Over the last 12 years, Oracle has invested more. There's been much more innovation. Our teams are significantly larger than they were before, and as Oracle number one priority is security, they've actually improved the security of the MySQL database. But it's still open source, which basically means you are free to have open access to the source code. The source code is open for anyone to have a look at. Okay. So this is quite an interesting comment from Gartner. Gartner actually did a survey of customers, and from 70% of the respondees that came back, they said that new in-house applications will be developed on open source databases, or database platforms as a service, which basically means open source databases in the cloud. From 89% of the respondees, 1/3 said that more than 50% of their organization's applications are running on open source database software. So in other words, what Gartner is telling industry is open source is here. It's no longer a fashionable thing, which would be nice to have. It's actually a mature product. It expands capabilities. It helps with data and analytics, and it's very much front and center. It's no longer in the peripheries, if that makes sense. So the question I have is, are you building or are you buying? Okay, if you are buying, what we're talking about there is a COTS application. COTS stands for commercial off-the-shelf. And these applications can be finance applications, warehouse applications, HR applications, CRM, ERP, any application that an organization actually purchases rather than build themselves. And typically they buy the application and they buy support for the application. In those situations, the question to ask is, does that application support multiple databases? And typically the answer will be yes. Great. Does it support MySQL? Now, this is where most COTS applications don't always support open source databases. They tend to be deeply integrated with the likes of Oracle and SQL Server. If the answer is no, they don't support MySQL, then MySQL is not the answer. We can't help them in those situations. We should move on and find other customers. However, if the customer is building an application, as I said before, engineered apps, then we should be exploring whether the customer are actually considering using open source software and tools. If they're not, it'll be interesting to understand from the customers how they stay competitive with other organizations within their industry, within their sector. Because what you find is within a sector, if one organization comes up with a new solution or a new value proposition, then others tend to follow suit. So they need to move very quickly. And typically you can do that easier with open source software. Also, does vendor lock-in matter to them? What I mean by that is, if you're using proprietary software, a lot of the time you're stuck and the customers don't have a choice on what they can do. And customers want to be free to choose what software they use so that they can be nimble and stay competitive, especially in the current economic climate. Also, when customers are building their own applications, sometimes they need powerful servers. These are servers that have many cores or are built on multiple VMs, virtual machines. What customers tend to find if they're using proprietary software is that if they are increasing the number of virtual machines or the number of cores that they're actually using, it has an implication on the software license cost. In other words, if you was to sell your customer a new server, which is faster, uses less electricity, and is much more efficient than their current server, they may find that even though the server is better and cheaper, there is an implication on the cost of the software they are running on the server because it has more cores or more sockets. So it's something to bear in mind. With open source software, we don't have these challenges. Also, certainly now when we look at COVID and the consequences of COVID in industry, many customers have budget constraints. When a customer has a budget constraint, you've got to obviously ask, obviously, do you want to spend a lot of your money on software before you start building your application? In other words, I genuinely believe now is the right time to be talking to customers about open source software and to be talking about MySQL, because they will be very keen to reduce their costs and move forward. Customers cannot stand still. They need to innovate. So how do you innovate when your budgets are constrained? Go to open source, go to MySQL, because we can save at least 90% on database costs being open source compared to the likes of SQL Server, IBM DB2, and Sybase, basically any proprietary database. So DB Engines, which is what I'm showing you here, is a ranking engine, which is a global organization that's basically looking at any blogs, any job adverts, any conversations about databases. It's all about databases. And they track this by month. So every month they're tracking it. And so the numbers tend to go slightly up, slightly down. But for many years now, the top three have been the top three: Oracle, MySQL, and then Microsoft SQL Server. You will see that the top three are significantly further ahead than the likes of Postgres and Mongo, which are also open source software. What's interesting in the top three is MySQL is the top open source database and the second most popular database in the world. The top three databases really take care of about 90% of the global database market. So we have about a third of the database market around the globe. And in 2019, DB Engines nominated MySQL as their database of the year. What's slightly more interesting, though, is there were surveys from JetBrains and Stack Overflow. They were asking developers, when you're writing your next application, what's the database you're going to use for that application? And in 60% of the cases for JetBrains and 56% for Stack Overflow, it was MySQL. So it was the top database. And you will see things like Mongo are roughly half, and you know, in both cases. And then you have Postgres and what have you. Even SQL Server you can see is significantly lower. So you can actually see not only Gartner is saying open source is becoming popular, even these sort of surveys of developers is demonstrating the same thing. Now, when it comes to MySQL, over the years, many people used to think of MySQL as that open source database thing for those small, non-mission critical, not important applications. But when it came to the serious applications for your business, then you used SQL Server or Oracle, right? Absolutely not the case. If you look at Facebook, that's about 3.2 billion users globally. It's probably the biggest application in the world, and it uses MySQL as their database of choice. When you look at Booking.com, they have millions and millions of reads of hotels, and when you're choosing a hotel to stay and things like that, and it's all managed by MySQL. But you'd kind of expect that in the e-commerce and social media sort of space. But what's more interesting is when you look at, say, government, if you go right to the bottom, you'll see the Indian flag there. The Indian government is using MySQL as their database to store the national ID cards for every single citizen in India. It's known as a PAN card. That's 1.2 billion citizens, and it's managed by MySQL. The one above that is Swedish police. It's their national police service in Sweden, and they use MySQL for front, middle, and back office. And as you can see, there's many other government organizations which use MySQL for mission-critical national infrastructure projects. And then we look at things like JP Morgan and Visa, as well as manufacturing, traditional manufacturing organizations, whether it's Volkswagen, Bosch, Tesla, and so on. Now, what you're seeing here is a mere pinprick of the number of organizations that are running MySQL. We claim that you are touching MySQL, even though you may not be aware of it, every single day when you go online or when you're doing anything related to IT. This is quite interesting. Data is growing. It is growing really, really fast. We're in 2021 now, and we're up to about 60 zettabytes of data. In the next 4 years, data is going to treble in size to 175 to 180 zettabytes. So that's a lot of databases. The database market is going to grow because as data grows, you need to put it on a database. Now, some would argue, yes, the biggest growth is going to be in the cloud. Even though the cloud database market is only worth about $10 billion at the moment, it's growing at 68%. But then I would also say that the traditional database market, which is worth nearly 50 billion and has a more modest growth of 18%, will also grow and will grow significantly. And as I say, even though it's a smaller percentage of a bigger number will probably mean a lot more money as well. But yeah, so it's something to look at. We have on-prem and we also have cloud. I'm sure you've heard about this. Data is your most valuable asset. Data is the new oil, right? it's only the new oil, and it's only your most valuable asset if you can make sense of your data, if you can make more sense of your data. If you're collecting all this data, you want to do something with it other than just store it. You want to analyze it. You want to do clever things like analytics on it to find additional information from it. The only problem when you're capturing so much data, though, is you're also capturing lots of personal information, personally identifiable information, things like your email address, date of birth, your payment card information, your name and address, your passport number, and so on. This is sensitive data, and you've got to really look after this data, because if it gets in the wrong hands, it can be quite embarrassing. And of course, we've heard of some serious database breaches recently. Capital One lost over 100 million records, Marriott 500 million records. British Airways was fined £183 million for their data breach. And I think Equifax is probably one of the most serious, because they actually provide credit scoring and what have you. And they had a fine of over $575 million for data breaches. I'm sure you've heard of GDPR. These fines will only get bigger if you don't secure your data. So what are CIOs talking about nowadays? Security. What a surprise. It is their number one most important thing on their mind that keeps them up at night. But in addition to that, they're also looking at digital transformation. What do we mean by that? What we're talking about there is things that are done on paper or done manually. How do you do those using computers automatically? How do you get a citizen to do things almost, if you like, self-service? So rather than going to the supermarket, you go online and purchase your goods from Tesco's or wherever, rather than going to the store. That's digital transformation. When we're talking about analytics, remember, data is your new oil. So analytics, business information, artificial intelligence, trying to learn about the data is ever so important to CIOs, as is cloud. Everyone's got a finite space for infrastructure. So if we can move some of the stuff to the cloud, is that going to be better for us? As well as improving the applications themselves and the infrastructure they have, and so on. So the ones I've highlighted in the top 6 are things that MySQL can influence. But looking at the number 1, security being the most important thing, we also take security incredibly seriously. That's why MySQL doesn't just have encryption. We have an entire security framework for security, because we care about the data which is on our database. Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to be talking about the MySQL Enterprise Edition. This is enterprise class. This is for your mission critical applications. This is for your production applications. This is basically for the systems that the organizations are presenting, not only for their internal staff, but also for their customers. You can't afford to have those go down, because people very quickly will go on to the next customer if your systems are not working. So we provide many advanced features for scalability, high availability, and so on. Obviously security, to ensure that the database is equipped and delivering what your customers require. But also from an administration point of view and from a development point of view, we provide lots of management tools so that your development team can very quickly develop those applications, and your administrators can actually look after the databases. And when we talk about support, of course you're going to get support, and you're going to get support 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But in addition to the traditional break-fix support, you're going to also get consultative support. And consultative support is basically where your database is working, but you need advice, you need guidance, you need to understand things, say how to improve the performance, you need backup strategies, anything like that. You have architectural considerations. You can basically ask us an unlimited amount of questions during the lifetime of your subscription, and we will answer those. And Oracle certifications I'll touch on a little bit later, but that's where we actually plug into Oracle management tools as well. Are you all still with me? Hopefully. Now, we've been talking about MySQL, but in addition to MySQL, there's NoSQL. And with Oracle MySQL, you get both. So there's a lot of confusion around what NoSQL means. Is it NoSQL? Is it non-SQL? Is it not only SQL? Traditional databases are, like Oracle, are SQL based. And some years ago, when NoSQL databases started to come up, people were talking about they're going to be the next generation of databases, and the days of SQL were limited or were coming to an end. The actuality is completely different. Relational databases, SQL databases aren't going anywhere. They're here to stay, and they're for general purpose, and they've been proven. But NoSQL databases are also required for specific tasks. And as an example, you've got MongoDB, which is a NoSQL database, and you've got Cloudera, which is a NoSQL database. So they're the same, right? Actually, they're not. They're like chalk and cheese. So NoSQL means different things to different people, but it's an absolute market to chase. And the reason I'm talking about NoSQL when we're talking about MySQL is because if you hear a customer requires NoSQL, MySQL can be the answer. Interestingly, Cloudera actually recommends MySQL to manage the metadata, which is kind of quite an irony. So, what are these NoSQL types of databases? The most popular NoSQL database is known as a document store, to be precise. And the most popular NoSQL document store is MongoDB. And MySQL is also a document store. So MySQL's NoSQL offering is document store. It's not a wide column store like Cassandra, or a key value like Redis, or a graph database like Neo4j. And then there's object databases and grid databases. These are all NoSQL. We are a document store, but we're also a traditional relational database as well. So we are the best of both worlds. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just wanted to show you the architecture. On the left-hand side, you have traditional relational databases, which is SQL, structured. And on the right-hand side, you have NoSQL, which are JSON collections. In other words, these are semi-structured, which is, so they're your document store. Now, they can connect to your applications using the standard protocol or the X protocol. You have APIs, and you have many, many connectors. So in other words, within the one database, you're getting both. So I couldn't help myself but to put this slide in to compare MySQL, NoSQL document store with MongoDB. For starters, with MySQL, it's one subscription, which gives you both relational database and NoSQL document store. Mongo does not have the capability of relational. They are only a NoSQL database. MySQL can join collections. Collections is the terminology given to NoSQL tables. So you can do collections, collections with tables, collections with collections, and so on. So we have the capability of joining things that Mongo can't. Training. With MySQL, an administrator who understands SQL and MySQL will only need 20 to 30 minutes to get up to speed with document store, because there are very few differences. But MongoDB is completely different. It's a completely different type of database. And so it's not untypical to have organizations having Mongo administrators just for that one database, which is an additional expense. The syntax in MySQL's XDev API is a lot simpler for developers to come up to speed with and then start interrogating. With Mongo, it's a far more complicated language compared to MySQL. And licensing with MySQL is much, much simpler compared to Mongo. And last but not least, MySQL has the financial backing of Oracle. We have the largest support and engineering team of any open source database in the world. We are just simply so much bigger than any of the other NoSQL or open source database players anywhere. It really is comparing chalk and cheese. So I mentioned right at the beginning, there's two different types of databases. There's a community version as well as a commercial version. So why do I say you should avoid the community version? Because with MySQL Enterprise Edition, you're actually getting value beyond just the actual database and the experts who are using it. It's very robust and efficient in the way you do backups. And it provides credibility that the backup will be valid and it will help you. From a developer's point of view, diagnosing issues using MySQL Enterprise Monitor is invaluable. So tuning and troubleshooting during the development lifecycle is much, much easier when you're using MySQL Enterprise Monitor. Also, if you've got lots of databases and you're not using MySQL Enterprise Monitor, you're going to need to point and look at each database individually, whereas MySQL Enterprise Monitor will aggregate and show you a view over every database. So you're not spending time firefighting the one database that's causing you the biggest problem. MySQL Enterprise Edition frees up the database administrators' time. You're not, the administrators are not spending time going on forums and talking to third parties who are giving you unproven solutions. You can talk directly with us, so you've got faster resolutions. And the implementation of bug fixes is going to give you peace of mind, because we are the custodians of the actual source code, even though it's open source. So we are issuing new versions all the time. So if we fix a bug, we're going to include that in the new version. Also, protecting sensitive data, we use transparent data encryption. And you have that in the community version. But to actually generate keys, have digital signatures, and to manage the keys on a separate database to the database where you've got your data can only be done using the Enterprise Edition. When I showed you Oracle certifications earlier, what I'm talking about there are the Oracle management tools. So if you can imagine the Oracle Enterprise Monitor as the MySQL Enterprise Monitor is a bit like your dashboard. Imagine having a car without a dashboard. You're not going to know how fast you're going. You're not going to know how much fuel you've got. You're not going to know if your car is running hot. It's going to be quite scary and not very, very good. It's not advisable. Same applies to databases. And the great thing about Oracle Enterprise Monitor, if they're running Oracle as well as MySQL, you end up with a single view of all of your Oracle databases, both MySQL and Oracle. And in addition to that, you can manage your keys with Key Vault. You can manage your backups with Backup Vault. You can manage your audit logs and so on, as well as migrations using Golden Gate. So there's many, many features with the Enterprise Edition. So what are the consequences if you're not using Enterprise Edition? Well, your administrators are going to spend much more time going through forums, talking to other experts to see what they think the problem could be and how to resolve those issues. How do the administrators know that they're not digging themselves into a deeper hole? Because some of the advice they may be getting may not be very good advice. How do they know how good the people who are giving the advice are, their pedigree, and so on? Also, the administrators will have no influence over us to fix bugs because we are focusing on the customers who are actually paying us. So that also will cause them a problem. So they'll have to find workarounds. And when you upgrade, you're going to need to change those workarounds and so on. If you've used some of the software that comes from the Enterprise Edition, you're going to find that backup and restore is much easier and a lot more robust. If you're not using Enterprise Backup, then what you're going to be doing is switching your database off to do a backup or to do a restore. And you may not have that luxury to be able to switch your database off. Also, using Active Directory or LDAP to integrate your user credentials with your databases can be quite useful. And we've spoken about transparent data encryption and it's far less secure in Community Edition. Frankly speaking, encryption in Community doesn't meet regulatory standards. And if you've not got Enterprise Monitor, you're not going to see your problems until they become big problems, and it's going to take you a lot longer to fix. So is it really worth it if all this is going wrong, not to pay the $5,000 per server? It's fairly inexpensive to protect your services. Now we're going to go on to software lock-ins. I'm going to pause the. Okay, so avoid software lock-ins. What am I talking about here? Another word for software lock-ins could be avoid being put over a barrel. With MySQL Enterprise Edition, we don't put you over a barrel. We don't lock you in. If you choose to purchase MySQL Enterprise Edition and for whatever reason you decide, actually, I want out, I no longer want the commercial edition of MySQL, you are free to leave anytime. It takes 3 commands. That's it. And the great thing about MySQL, the Enterprise Edition MySQL engine is the same as the community MySQL engine. So we're not trying to make it difficult for you whatsoever. So you're free to leave anytime. I'd like to say that's probably quite unique, and it's quite typical of open source software, where we don't try to lock you in. Avoid forks and proprietary cloud solutions when you're looking at MySQL. So at the time when at the time when Oracle acquired MySQL, there were many organizations that sprung up because MySQL is open source, right? So that means anyone can take the open source code and compile it and then provide support for it. We could create the Archie SQL database service just as easily as we are creating the MySQL Oracle MySQL database service. But there is only one true MySQL, and that's Oracle MySQL. Companies such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google, MariaDB all have their variation of Oracle MySQL. Now, Oracle MySQL is the MySQL version that's got massive investment and innovation, and we're taking lots of inputs from the community and are providing, if you like, we're the custodians of the actual source code, which millions of customers are using globally. If you go for one of those forks like Maria, Google, Microsoft, and so on, you're now suddenly limited with the number of customers who are using that version. And in some cases, like MariaDB, their development paths going in a different direction to Oracle MySQL. So the binary is no longer compatible either. So it can be quite risky, and then you end up becoming locked in, as I was talking about earlier, rather than being sort of not locked in. Okay, so that's what I mean by forks create their own products. You know, it's very, very easy for any organization to create their own, but they simply cannot provide anything like the support that Oracle MySQL provides. And also they'll need to incorporate their own patching and roadmap policies, which we already have, and that in itself would cause challenges. So this diagram here just kind of shows you that, what I've just spoken about in a slightly different way. You'll come across on cloud, AWS is Amazon Web Services, you'll come across something called RDS. That is Amazon's version of MySQL in a managed cloud, managed database cloud. Avoid it because it's not MySQL. The same applies to Azure and the same applies to Google. And MariaDB's kind of taken our source code and recompiled it and called it their own. So that's something different again. The only true MySQL is Oracle MySQL. So what we're talking about here is infrastructure compared to platform as a service. So what I would say to you is if you're migrating from on-premise to the cloud, it becomes much harder if you're going to a platform rather than staying on infrastructure. There's always implications when you're looking at platform as a service. So that's basically a managed database service around versioning, patching, backups, and support. They also, the likes of Google and AWS and Azure will impose their own limitations on the functionality that you're being given. So for example, with AWS, you can't run MySQL and NoSQL. In the case of Azure, which is from Microsoft, they give you Oracle MySQL or part of it, a cut down version, and then they use a different database for NoSQL. In the case of Google, they say if you're looking at complex MySQL, use Oracle MySQL rather than their MySQL, which is kind of cool. So you need to understand the total cost of ownership when you're starting to look at some of these things. And also, what's your exit strategy? If you want to leave one of these cloud providers, if you're on a platform as a service, it becomes quite difficult, especially if their version of MySQL is their unique version and not the standard version, which is being used by millions of users out there. It's going to mean a lot of rework. So here's an example of MySQL on AWS, and the EC2 is infrastructure and the RDS is the platform service, platform as a service. So on the RDS, you don't get any MySQL support or anything like that. It is their version of MySQL. And then you can see some of those points we've highlighted that you do not get on RDS, that you do get on EC2. The reason you get it on EC2 is because it's an infrastructure and you bring your own license on EC2. So you run Oracle MySQL on EC2. But guess what? MySQL also has a database service. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and explain what we're offering compared to the competition. If you look at Google, if you look at AWS, and if you look at Azure, Microsoft Azure, they can be classified as first generation cloud. They've got some pretty cool features like elastic resources, pay for what you use, high scale, self-service, and so on. And they're pretty cool features and quite good for anyone who wants to use cloud. Oracle's been slightly later to the cloud market compared to those guys. So we've looked at what's good in the cloud and we've taken that. So we've taken all those good stuff that the others have. But because Oracle always think about security first, they've actually built their cloud, it's called OCI or Gen 2, from the ground up with security in mind. And because we're always working with enterprise software, we understand how to improve performance. We have superior economics. In other words, because we own some microsystems, we own technology. But the great thing about the Oracle Gen 2 cloud, it's also based on an open ecosystem. So we're not locking you in. So the great thing about that from a MySQL point of view is it's really easy to get yourself up and running in the MySQL database service. In other words, on the cloud, but the Oracle cloud. It's instant provisioning. It's got the latest features. It's very secure. Data protection, security is at the heart of everything Oracle think of and what MySQL thinks of. It's got all those advanced security features and the latest security updates. It's also built on an enterprise-ready platform. It's using the latest features of MySQL Enterprise Edition. It's not using these cut-down versions that the other competition are using. The great thing about that is if you're using MySQL, Oracle MySQL on-premise, and you want to use Oracle MySQL in the MySQL database service, it's the same product. So it's very easy to migrate and move your work from on-premise to the Oracle cloud. It's so straightforward to move it on and to take it off. And as you see in the top right-hand corner, it's 100% genuine Oracle MySQL. We're the custodians. Here's something which is different as well, which you may not be aware of. Everybody gives you a service level agreement if you're going on the cloud, right? They talk about uptime, and they will give you a 99.9% uptime. Otherwise, they will pay penalties. You can go to Google, you can go to Amazon, you can go to Microsoft, and they'll all talk about uptime SLAs. But they won't talk about performance or management SLAs. They're unique to Oracle Cloud. So not only are we giving you an uptime, we're guaranteeing you the performance of your database. We're also guaranteeing the performance of our management of your database. And you do not get that from any other cloud provider. From a pricing point of view, we are a lot more efficient, and so we are cheaper. We're not just cheaper on storage, we're cheaper on memory. We're also cheaper on backup compared to the main competition. Obviously, there's other cloud providers as well, but these are the main ones, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So these numbers may not mean a lot as you're looking at them on a chart. So looking at it on a graph, we're about a third of the price of the next cloud service, if you like, which is Google. And Google's slightly cheaper than Microsoft, and Microsoft slightly cheaper than Amazon. And you can see MySQL is cheaper than all of them, the MySQL database service. So that is us managing the database for you in the Oracle Cloud. But that's not all. Okay, but in the next few slides, I'll show you something else. But this is the architecture. You have the customer, hopefully you can see my mouse. You have the customer working in the public subnet and the private subnet. That's where the customer will operate and manage their database. And using a virtual link or a private connection, it goes into the database itself, which is where Oracle sits. They sit in the internal tenancy. Oracle cannot see what the customer's doing, and the customer cannot see what Oracle's doing. And that increases the security. And so the database sits there in the internal tenancy. So it's very, very secure for customers' data and how they actually interact with the cloud. In addition to the MySQL cloud service, we've also got an analytics service in the cloud, in the Oracle Cloud. And this will compete with the likes of Google Big Data or Big Analytics. I think it's called Big Data. and also AWS Redshift. These are the analytics engines for Google and AWS, and I'm sure Microsoft also have their version as well. Our version is called HeatWave. Subtle difference between ours and the competition here as well. With the competition, when you want to run analytics, you need to do something known as ETL, extract, transform, and load. In other words, you need to take your data out of one repository and put it in another to run analytics. Whereas with MySQL, both the data in your OLTP application, which is your InnoDB engine, in other words, your normal cloud service, and your analytics service is in the same database. You're not having to put it into a separate repository. So this is a big benefit for organizations, because for starters, from a security point of view, there's less touch points, so it stays in one place. It works without changing any of your queries that you've written for your database. These are known as SQL queries. If you've created some reporting and queries for your database, they're going to work in your analytics service as well without any changes. And the great thing about HeatWave, the MySQL analytics service, it's roughly 400 times faster than the standard MySQL InnoDB reporting and performance. Huge differences. So how does this look from a cloud architecture point of view? This diagram, it looks almost exactly the same as the previous one I showed you, bar two little red boxes that are added at the bottom there. So the customer is still working in the public and private subnet. You see they connect in through the VPN, and the database is sitting here with the block storage, which is where we're sitting. The customer switches the flag on to say, yes, I want HeatWave, and these two additional red boxes appear. And that's basically in-memory nodes. And what happens is for analytics, which are better done in HeatWave, those queries are pushed down into the red boxes automatically. And as I say, this means on the same data, if you can imagine, this is the time it takes in standard MySQL, and with HeatWave, it's 400 times quicker. So it's a huge efficiency gain. So you can have whatever applications on the left-hand side connected to your MySQL database, social, e-commerce, engineered applications, and so on. So they're going into your MySQL database, but also into your analytics service. And that's going to do all your compute. That's going to give you your results on your queries. And then on your right-hand side, you're going to want to be able to surface those results graphically or in a pre-way. And obviously, we'd love you to use Oracle Analytics Cloud, but not every customer wants to use that. So you can use Qlik, Looker, Tableau, or any other tool to actually visualize the results from what queries you've actually put to the data. Now, what if my application is on-premise? What if all my MySQL instances are on-premise? Can I make use of HeatWave? The answer is yes. What you will do is replicate your on-premise MySQL data into a MySQL database service in the cloud, which then is automatically connected to HeatWave. And then that will give you and generate your results, which will then be pushed back to your site to surface up on premise. So it's absolutely possible to run on premise and then replicate to the cloud. So the benefits of MySQL with HeatWave, it's a single MySQL database for both your analytics and your standard sort of data and storing of your data. You get all the cloud infrastructure advantages, security, service level agreements, all on the same database. All the existing applications will work without any changes on HeatWave. It enables you to run analytics on stored data, which is on-premise and not in the cloud, by replicating onto the MySQL database service. It accelerates MySQL and scales almost linearly from gigabytes to tens of terabytes. What you will find with SQL is if there's lots of joins, the results will take longer to come back. But with HeatWave, that will happen much, much faster. You'll always be working on the most advanced versions of MySQL Enterprise Edition when you're running the MySQL database service. As you can see, it's dramatically faster and much, much lower cost compared to the other cloud providers. And Oracle Premier support is obviously included. And you see in the top right-hand corner, you're using 100% genuine Oracle MySQL, not a fork, not a cut down version. So at any time, if you wanted to go back on premise, you can. We're almost to the end. So in summary, why should this be of interest to you? Software is less cost, right? More budget for hardware, more budget for other things. We are at least 90% cheaper than proprietary database software. We're licensed per server, not per socket or core. Most proprietary software is licensed per core. We are not. Become the customer's trusted advisor and champion by offering alternatives. Add value, save your customer money. If all you're going to do is offer the same as everybody else, it becomes a discounting race to the bottom. Whereas if you're offering, say, your hardware with MySQL, so you're creating an appliance, for example, you're offering something the competition cannot. You might want to offer first-line support for some of your other products alongside MySQL, and then you will back that off with us. Suddenly, you're offering something nobody else can. And with the MySQL Enterprise software, you really are getting an enterprise-grade database for all your engineered workloads. It's got very good security features, monitoring, audit, and many other features. 24/7 365 support. It's used by many organizations globally already, and it's trusted by the developers. Conversations to be had with your business and infrastructure owners. They're going to be keen to ensure that their architects are using the latest and best technology. They're going to be interested in delivering new applications using the latest technology, getting it out there fast. They don't want to be focusing on the development of the database. They don't want to be doing database administration forever. So using the enterprise management tools will save them time. Of course, you're reducing the total cost of ownership because of the way MySQL is licensed. Now, software asset management. Within organizations, they're forever concerned about whether or not they are properly licensed. So say your organization has got servers and they're moving to something like Dell EMC VxRail or Nutanix, where they're actually looking to maximize their servers for their applications, where they're almost creating a separation between compute and the servers, so that they can turn the dial up and down dependent on the needs of the application. That can cause you non-compliance issues with proprietary software, but it doesn't cause you any issues with Oracle MySQL because you're paying per node. So even though the core count could significantly increase because it's Grand National Day, therefore you need to bump up the amount of compute power for certain applications, or it's Black Friday. So lots of people are online doing lots of purchases, so certain applications need more horsepower. In those situations, you're not contravening your licensing rules when you're using MySQL. Ensure your database administrators are able to support your MySQL databases to make their life easy, make their job easier using the enterprise tooling and the management tools. Can you deliver more to your line of businesses with less budget? If you think about it, we're in the middle of this COVID pandemic. Many businesses have hit the wall. Obviously, we can't help them. But the ones who haven't hit the wall, but can see that they need to make drastic cuts, will be looking at how they make these drastic cuts. What do they need to keep running, and what can they switch off? At the same time, they need to innovate. They need to show, they need to be attractive to their customers so that their customers come back to them. So they are going to invest and change things and move and do things with IT. And in those situations, if you're using MySQL, it's going to be a significant difference in cost compared to other database products. So in summary, are your customers looking to reduce their software costs? Do they build their own applications? Are they using open source software? If not, why not? Do they need to meet regulatory and compliance standards? Things like GDPR, things like PCI DSS, which is Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standard. These are serious standards. And if you don't comply with them, you saw the fines that some organizations have had for data leaks. So customers in companies would take these standards very seriously. If you're in the banking industry, if you're into public sector, if you're in a regulated industry, you're going to take care of these standards. You're going to want to make sure you comply. With MySQL, we assist you to comply. We don't give you a silver bullet that says, yes, you use my technology, which equals compliance. No, because some of this is a business process. Some of this is not to do with technology, but we certainly help you along the way. Are they currently using the free version of MySQL? Very risky. If they are, they're probably having challenges with backups because they can't do a backup unless they switch the database off. And how sure are they that that backup is good? If they ever need to rely on the backup, will it actually restore their data, or is it corrupted? Do they know? What about security and monitoring and support? How do they actually do that if they're using the free version of MySQL? Also, if the customer's got lots of Oracle software within their organization, did they know that they can actually leverage those Oracle management tools, the stuff they've just spent millions of pounds for? Can they actually did they know they can use MySQL with those tools so that they can actually get more for their money? This is something which we should be telling them. At the end of the day, we would like to help and assist your customers realize the benefits and savings with MySQL. Thank you. Do we have any questions?